Hi, my name's Ken Chisholm, and I'd like to read to you my new ghost story for this year. It's called Divided Highways. So it was December last year when I was in Halifax for a few days of acting work the week before Christmas, and was booked into a seat on a shuttle back to Cape Breton the day before December the 25th. Seats were at a premium, and our shuttle was an extra run leaving late in the afternoon. Because I was the first passenger to be picked up, the driver, "Hi, I'm Dave. Just call me Dave," he said, from under the visor of his Gillis Auto Wreckers ball cap. Dave assigned me a back seat just in front of where he stowed my luggage. The sun was already low in the west by the time the shuttle driver had collected all of my fellow passengers, and we headed out of Halifax on the divided highway toward Cape Breton. Along with the driver, "Just call me Dave, boss," there were 5 of us. A young man wearing a ball cap with the logo of the Midtown Tavern embossed on it occupied the front passenger seat. He was heading out to Judic, and was getting out at the tourist information kiosk in Port Hastings to wait for his drive up the west coast of the island. There were 2 older ladies in the middle 2 seats, who, despite sharing age and gender, one was plainly dressed and quite prim, while the other wasn't dressed for the cold, instead looked like she was ready to play an opening set of hard-driving blues. They chatted amiably about children and work. "Do you live in Cape Breton?" the plain-dressed woman asked. "No," the more distinctively dressed lady replied. "I've been away for a while, working on the road." Our last passenger, a stubble-faced, skinny fellow in a blood-red hoodie, was acquired at a gas station across the road from the great yard filled with long steel boxes of shipping containers stacked high next to the harbor. "You had some car troubles," Dave the driver said, as he asked the young man for his fare up front. "Yeah, the cops stopped my girlfriend and her insurance was expired," he replied, adding just before he launched himself into the seat next to mine. "Also, she had a couple of outstanding warrants." Dave the driver counted Red Hoodie's fare twice, and we were on our way to Cape Breton. Out of Halifax, past the malls and industrial parks, past the turnoffs for cozily titled subdivisions, the roadside clutter of gas stations and franchise coffee shops, and on to the divided highway taking us to Truro, and then the eastward swing turn to Cape Breton. Not long after we left Halifax, Dave the driver announced, "Just so you know, I have a delivery to make along Route 4, so we're going that way once we get off the causeway." "My son promised me that this shuttle only goes to Trans-Canada," said Rock and Roller Lady. "Usually we do," Dave the driver said, "but sometimes the delivery companies throw us some work, and since it's Christmas, it's always good to make a little extra. Besides, we'll still be right on schedule, so no worries." Rock and Roller Lady looked like she might have had a worry, but she didn't say anything else. Just a few more minutes after that, we passed the turnoff to a big rest stop on a ridge visible from the highway. A flatbed truck with an aluminum dolly attached to its rear was part of the traffic merging from the off-ramp, with the traffic in the lane to our right. The truck was a little ahead of us, but we were speeding up to pass it. I could see in the glare of the highway lights there was something glossy and black laid out and padded and strapped in holding areas in the truck bed. "Look there," the plain-dressed woman said. "That truck is carrying headstones." "There's a lot of them," the Rock and Roller Lady said. Maybe they had a Christmas sale, the First Lady joked. I feel like someone is walking on my grave, Rock and Roller Lady said, with an exaggerated shiver. I tried to read the names of the stones, but our van accelerated and the truck fell behind us. The divided highway was faster and safer, but everything was at a remove. Turn-offs were few and mostly for connections to the towns the highway bypassed. These towns were glimpsed fleetingly through trees, over marshes, the colored lights of the few houses visible like far-off messages barely readable. We made the swing east at Truro onto another set of divided highways. Occasionally the off-ramps led to more gas stations, more fast food outlets, more name-brand vendors. The actual town seemed to be an afterthought. When we stopped in Antigonish, not far from the causeway, everyone in the van, except for Red Hoodie Guy, got out and filed into the coffee shop. I went directly to the men's room, and after that lined up to order a tea behind the Rock and Roller Lady. She was being served by a grandmotherly woman who called everyone dear or hun, and did her work with a practiced authority. Her name tag read Della. The Rock and Roller Lady ordered a specialty tea, and Della said, "Sure, hun," and bustled about getting her order. The other passengers from the van stood chatting with Dave the driver, mostly about their holiday plans. Della brought the Rock and Roller Lady's tea, handed it to her across the counter, and said, "Sorry for your loss, hun, but I hope you have a good Christmas anyway." "I haven't had a loss," the woman said, almost dropping her tea. "Oh, I'm sorry, hun. I thought I heard one of your group mention it. My mistake, dear. Have a safe trip," Della said, and quickly asked me for my order. The Rock and Roller Lady quickly went outside. Della leaned over the counter and whispered to me, "Well, that was embarrassing. Not often I make that mistake." "What mistake?" I asked. "We see so many folk come through here. Most are okay, but some I get this shiver-like, and it usually means they had a death of someone close. Not often I get wrong, either." I waved off the change for my tea. "Guess my tuner's off the station. Anyway, Merry Christmas. You too. It will be at 12 when I get off." Red Hoodie Boy was still wheezing, snoring in the back seat. Everybody else was happy and more relaxed that we were only a short distance from Cape Breton, except for Rock and Roller Lady, who sat rigid and apprehensive. All the way on the short ride to the causeway, I looked for roadside signs promoting all the small-town businesses I knew from my childhood that lived on the trade from passing motorists. But now they were dying in exile from the new divided highway. Approaching the causeway linking the island of Cape Breton to the Nova Scotia mainland, the highway fused back together, and roadside businesses reappeared. We passed the big stop in Ald's Cove, and the causeway came in view as a dark, solid line of stone in the waters of the Strait of Canso. Everyone seemed more relaxed and happy once we crossed over the causeway and under the steel girder bridge that proclaimed, "Welcome to Cape Breton." Everyone except the Rock and Roller Lady. Once we passed over the bridge, and just before we approached the roundabout, the driver stopped to let the young man heading for Judith out at the Tourist Information Bureau. And everyone wished him a Merry Christmas, and we headed off through Port Hastings. We continued through to Port Hawkesbury with little traffic on the usually busy highway, past houses and stores lightly decorated and brightly decorated with tinsel and colored lights, and we were quickly on the ramp to the divided highway between Port Hawkesbury and St. Peter's. Outside, the shadowed silhouettes of the fir trees lining the highway were barely visible. No houses, no businesses, no sign of any human habitation was visible, and so it would be for the next 20 minutes or so. The prospect outside my window was so dark and cheerless I almost allowed myself to drift into sleep, like Red Hoodie Guy beside me. Our approach to St. Peter's was heralded by roadside signs promising cafes and restaurants, gift shops, a Christmas shop, and the ubiquitous coffee and donuts. The divided highway suddenly merged into a single road, and around a curve and up a hill we were in St. Peter's, with colorfully lit storefronts lining both sides of the road. But all the shops were closed for Christmas, and we kept on driving. "Oh," Dave the driver said, "I almost forgot. It's time for my stories." He jabbed at the console of the satellite radio and it gave a compliant squawk as it came to rest on a new station. "Does anybody else like Stella's stories?" he asked into the darkness. Nobody answered. "She's got the best stories, and they're all true. And tonight, she's even got one from Cape Breton." "Have you heard this one?" A low feminine voice purred from the radio. "I bet you haven't. Tonight's Christmas tale comes all the way from lonely Cape Breton Island, all the way out in the stormy and spooky North Atlantic." I think I might have voluntarily harumphed because Dave the driver asked, "Are you all right back there?" "I'm fine," I meekly replied. "Nobody minds if I turn it up." Nobody minded. Now to set the mood, a song from a great Cape Breton balladeer, John Allen Cameron. Then there was the familiar sound of a 12-string guitar and the lilt of Cameron's voice singing, "Last night there were 4 Marys. This night there'll be but 3. There was Mary Seaton and Mary Beaton and Mary Carmichael and me." From my perch at the back of the van, I noticed rock and roller lady start in her seat and put her arm straight out, her hand poised in midair as if she would reach past Dave the driver to change the channel. But she didn't. The song continued its melancholy tale of a young woman accused of a terrible betrayal and soon to be hung from a yew tree for her offense. I remember singing it around a campfire in a picturesque village along the sparkling shore of the Bredor Lake. There lived 4 young girls, all named Mary. The melodic voice of Stella intoned. I looked out my window. The sparkling Bredor was a solemn black, the silver of moon giving it the luster of a judge's robe. The voice continued on the radio. They were all the same age, and following 5 different genealogies, they were all cousins. They were all neighbors, living in 4 houses that faced each other in a square. They were all playmates since they were babies. And they were inseparable, forever inseparable. Or so they believed. The rock and roller lady put her hand to her mouth as if she was stifling a sob. There was Mary Frances, who they called Frankie, the red-headed beauty with the open heart. Mary Donelda, or Donnie, the funny one with the cutting tongue, but a stickler for the rules. Mary Louise, or Lulu, the quiet one, but the keeper of secrets. And finally, Mary Margaret, Peggy, the adventurous one with the voice of an angel. Rock and roller lady let out a sharp bark of laughter. Sorry, she said. Bad Timbit. The radio voice continued. When they were still young, their grandmother, Mary Constance Verity, gathered them and told them how when she was growing up, she and her sisters made a sacred promise to each other they would never lower themselves to buy their Christmas presents from a store, or even worse, buy from a catalog from Upper Canada that charged like the devil and never sent you what you actually asked for. Their presents would be made with their own two hands, or found in the world with their own two eyes, or be some kind act given with their own loving heart. The four Marys thought this was a wonderful idea and promised their grandmother they would pinky swear this would be their new Christmas gift tradition. And their grandmother went off to her afternoon tea in O'Kate's, believing she had taught her granddaughters a lesson in holiday economics. But Peggy, the wild one, insisted they have a special promise made up to ensure everyone obeyed the rule. Although they said it bordered on witchery, Peggy said it was the only way to do it, and Lulu, who had a literary bent, would write for them a proper oath. The next morning, Lulu read from her diary the oath she claimed to have received in a dream. Their reservations now forgotten, they all loved it so much they sat on the floor of Donnie's bedroom and recited the oath in unison. Something from the wild, something from the lake, something from the sky. The rock and roller lady was chanting along with Stella, causing the older lady to glance at her in puzzlement. Something only the heart can make. Stella continued on. No one breaks the oath, no one breaks the square, but will taste cold death. Something only the heart repairs. The second they finished reciting the oath, a mighty wind rushed up from the boudoir, and it felt like the whole house would be lifted into the clouds. The girls gaped at each other, goggle-eyed, and giggled at the theatricality of the coincidence, half believing they had summoned some mystical force. Over the years, the oath ensured their gifts were chosen with care, sparkling stones taken from the shores of the lake that looked like small mackerel and even small baby lobster. An empty bird's nest intricately braided with a sparkling blue thread. A sun-bleached branch that looked like some dreadful haunted character with its spindly arms raised in comic alarm. "That's Mr. McBoogles," Donnie said with wonder. "How did you know what Mr. McBoogles looks like?" But Lulu, the keeper of secrets, only smiled and asked if she liked her gift. Even as they grew up, there was a part of them that remained young and remained true to their oath. Even after their grandmother, Mary Constance Verity, passed on and was buried in the churchyard around the bend in the road from where their four houses stood, they remained true to their oath. Frankie the beauty became more beautiful. The wind from the lake would catch her red hair, and everyone would say it was like seeing a beating heart. Although she was followed by all the young men from miles up and down the road, she only allowed one into her heart, and while he worked out west, Frankie stayed at home, happily raising their children. Donnie became a teacher, a legendary terror in the classroom to those who felt the lash of her tongue. She married a fellow teacher who worked in the same bid school up the road. He was from off island, but he knew all the fun party songs, so he was accepted into the community in under a decade. Lulu stayed at home, tending her ailing father, needing no other company than his tales of working the boats on the Great Lakes, and the secrets of people of all ages who opened to her their hearts, which she kept locked in her heart. Petty was heard singing the Four Marys at a church concert, and a producer at the local CBC radio station asked her to sing it on the radio. She sang at more concerts and soon had a band and was singing at the taverns and at dances. Soon, the other three girls saw less and less of Petty, especially after she attracted the attention of Halifax audiences with a torchy, soulful rendition of the Four Marys. That was her first signal, and was played all through the Atlantic provinces. That notice sent her further down the road to Toronto. Then she toured to Vancouver, on the far west coast of the country. "That was you?" the plain-dressed woman asked in awe. "Yes, Milly, that was me," Mary Margaret replied. The radio narrator continued. But Mary Margaret always returned home for Christmas. Only now her presents were found on the shore of Lake Ontario, where eagle feathers from the Rockies and once tiny gold nuggets from a tour through New Mexico. Wherever how far away they came from, they were all gratefully received with open, loving hearts. Petty was living in Los Angeles. Her agent was finalizing a contract for her to sing the song over the end credits of a Disney princess movie. She was busy recordings, stuck in a big, busy Sydney, barely able to take a breath of her own, and the day rushing to find herself a flight back home for Christmas. She arrived at Donnie's house. It was her turn to host their Christmas gift-giving party. In a rush, having taken a cab all the way from Sydney, determined to prove how much it meant for her to be home at last. The women assembled in Donnie's front room after they returned from midnight mass at the little church around the bend in the road, and exchanged their presents. Frankie burst out in laughter, seeing the little bird house Lulu had constructed from pieces of wood she had found along the side of the road near her father's house. "Where's Daniel?" Donnie asked Petty. "Oh, his father asked him if he could have him for the holidays," Petty said, looking down at the floor as if studying her gifts. "He had a gig in Vegas, and he wanted the company. Here now, these are my gifts," Petty said, handing out 3 expertly wrapped parcels, so unlike Petty's usual careless wrapping, to each of her friends. "It was a last-minute thing with Danny's dad, and I thought I might be stuck in L.A. all on my own." Outside, the breeze from the lake had picked up, and a whistling began under the eaves of the house. Without saying another word, the 3 women unwrapped their gifts. Each was in an identical embossed with the name of a famous Los Angeles boutique, which happened to have an outlet at the airport. The sound of the wind grew in intensity, becoming almost a shriek. Inside each box was a beautiful silk scarf, blue for Lulu, green for Frankie, red for Donnie. Around them the rising wind made the windows in their frames rattle like bones. The 3 friends all said how lovely their scarves were, and just then a window pane cracked in 2 in its pain. "You don't like them," Petty said with real anger in her voice. You think I broke that stupid oath. It wasn't stupid when you made us swear to it, Donnie said. We kept it all these years. Maybe it's time to grow up, Peggy said. Anyway, you're the one who broke the oath, Donnie said. You're the one who it'll come looking for. Hush, Donnie, Frankie said. We'll look right smart in these scarves. Thank you so much, Peggy. You're welcome, Frankie, Peggy said. Then she stuck her tongue out at Donnie, and Donnie stuck her tongue out back at her. The rest of the holiday was joyous with children and grandchildren and more singing and celebration than 100 swanky Hollywood parties. But even as she was flying home to gather her son at the airport, Peggy still remembered the cracked window and the oath promising death to the one breaking its solemn vow. Years passed, and that shadow stayed on Peggy's heart. Her son, a grown man now, had an idea to revitalize her career by going back to Cape Breton to record a new arrangement of the Four Marys. She agreed on the one condition: she didn't have to go near her home community. But she found some insistent wind in her ears saying she would find herself on the wild road that clambers along the brink of the coastline through where she had called a curse upon herself. And just then, as I sat in amazement, around a turn there was the church, and next to it the disorderly sprawl of grave markers and leaning crosses. I could hear rock and roller lady, Mary Margaret as I now knew her to be, hold her breath. We all did. We had all just driven into her story. Then the voice on the radio cut out, followed by the van's engine. We rolled to a stop close to the graveyard. I think it's the alternator, Dave the driver said. No, Mary Margaret said calmly. It's something else. Dave the driver held his cell phone out of his window, waving it around, squinting at the screen, finally concluding, No reception. I'll see to the engine. It's not going to start for you, Mary Margaret said. Not now. There's houses all around, Dave the driver said, waving his hand up and down the road. Somebody will help us. I'm going to get out to stretch my legs, Millie said. I think I'd like to do that too, I said. Do you mind? Mary Margaret reluctantly opened her door and stepped onto the pavement. A stiff breeze rose from the lake. What's that? Millie said, pointing up the graveyard close to the road. She found the flashlight app on her cell phone and pointed it to a spot under a copse of yew trees. Incredibly, it was a freshly dug grave. Holy Mother, Mary Margaret said. It's the curse. It's coming for me. Curse, Dave the driver said. Don't be foolish. I broke the oath with those awful scarves, Mary Margaret said. She pointed wildly toward the grave. That hole is meant for me. Stop being a little girl, Millie said. You're a grown woman. You heard the story on the radio, Mary Margaret said. It's been waiting. Shh, I said, holding my hand up to quiet them. Do you hear what I hear? Everyone stood quiet, listening. We could hear Red Hoodie Guy snoring in the back seat of the van. We could hear the wind from the lake rising as it whistled through the trees. And we could hear a lone fiddle in the distance playing the Four Marys. Come on, Danny, the driver said, heading off towards the bend in the road beyond the cemetery. Somebody is still up. Maybe we can phone for help from their house. And maybe we can get out from the cold and damp, Milly said. Mary Margaret had a wild look in her eyes. It's probably better to be indoors than standing next to an open grave, I suggested. Looking unconvinced, she still fell in step with me, her face dark with dread. We came around the bend, and there was an open area at the end of a short driveway that led to 4 houses that stood facing each other like the sides of a square. The inside of the square was crowded with vehicles, and the lights blazing from all the windows of one of the houses lit the yard. It was from this house that the mournful refrain of the fiddle could be heard. The 4 of us approached the front door of that house. Dave the driver rapped on the door. The fiddle paused in mid-phrase. The door opened, and there stood before us a young woman with clear blue eyes and deep red hair that the breeze from the lake caught and lifted, making it look like a beating heart. Frankie, Mary Margaret exclaimed. The young woman blinked in surprise. You're my Aunt Peg. Come in. I'm Margaret Ann. I was only a little kid the last time you came to see Nana Mar. Where's Frankie? Mary Margaret asked, a trace of apprehension in her voice. She's in the parlor, Margaret Ann said, moving aside to let us pass. In front of us was the living room with its comfortable chairs facing the big screen television, and the tall decorated spruce tree felled somewhere in the woods up the hill behind the houses. We followed Margaret through the crowded room, past the fiddler who had finally dropped his bow. Through the door to the back parlor reserved for special visits, like those of the parish priest. We could see the furniture had been moved out of the way to make room for the compact, plain coffin holding the remains of Mary Frances. She wanted to be waked at home, Margaret Ann said, just like when you were growing up. How? Mary Margaret could barely speak. It was quick, a stroke. She got up early to bake her shortbreads. She had everything laid out. I came over to help. I found her. Margaret Ann's voice trembled, and Mary Margaret put her hand on the younger woman's shoulder. In the corner next to the open casket, 2 older women stood. Peggy, one of them softly said. Donnie, Mary Margaret answered. Ooh, she said to the other woman. The 3 women embraced. Peggy drew back and said, I wish I'd brought something to make up for that debacle that last time when we exchanged gifts. Ooh was shaking her head. But that was our fault. After you left, Frankie said you must have been missing your boy for the holidays, Donnie said. And that you must have been missing him something fierce, Lou said. And all we were going on was about following the rules of a pinky swear, Donnie said, her cheeks reddening. I listened then for the rising wind, but heard nothing. My attention came back to the 3 women when I heard Mary Margaret singing the 4 Marys. Last night there were 4 Marys. This night there'll be but 3. The women joined their voices in almost a prayer for their friend. The 3 of us from the shuttle watched while cups of strong tea were pressed into our hands and trays of squares and cookies and petite sandwiches were on offer. Then help came from Sydney, and the van miraculously revved up on its own. And without Red Hoodie Boy ever waking up, we were back on the road, and each of us delivered to our front doors. Dave, the driver, kept the radio off. But I wanted to know the end of Stella's story, the one she told on the radio. But every time I searched the internet for a link to her show, I found nothing about the story. I researched at least once a week in the months that followed, but never saw a mention of that story. Then it was suddenly there. I followed the link and I heard Stella's sultry drawl in a preface say, "Thank you, Mary Louise, for sharing your story of friendship." The date given as its first broadcast was exactly 1 year to the day when we heard it in Dave the driver's shuttle van. Lulu's ending was accurate, but heartfelt description of their final reunion in that house on the Brador, the final reunion of the four Marys. Lulu wrote, "The world is full of roads to everywhere, and the vehicles on those roads speeding ever faster and faster, and the people in those vehicles see less and less of the towns and villages they whiz by, and even less of the people living in those towns and villages. But we forget we are all on one road, traveling towards one destination, and who we choose to share that road with is what makes a life." Thank you for listening to my story called Divided Highways.